What if? All that you believed you knew about Matthew was only the tip of a much deeper iceberg. His name is revered through history as one of the 12 apostles, the man who penned the first gospel in the New Testament. But who was Matthew prior to discerning Jesus as his disciple? What story within a story does he tell that most people ignore? He wasn't raised a believer. Matthew's story is one of transformation, redemption, and some life-altering news that not many people expected. He was hated by his own people, a tax collector for the Roman Empire, one considered a traitor to the Jewish nation. And still, he did get picked for something bigger than he ever could have envisioned. To really understand Matthew, we need to go back to the 1st century. We need to go back to the busy streets of Capernaum, to a time when the weight of the Roman Empire was heavy on the shoulders of the Jewish people. It was an age of corruption and heavy taxation and deep social divisions. And here also was where a man named Levi, later called Matthew, became embroiled in controversy. On the surface, Matthew was an unlikely disciple. Tax collectors were among the most despised people in Jewish society. They served Rome, collecting money from their own people, usually jack up the amount so they could keep a part for themselves. This made them wealthy, but also pariahs, loathed by the religious leaders, avoided by the common people, and regarded as irredeemable sinners. I had no idea. But why did Matthew pick this life? It was greed, or no, it was survival. The fact is, many Jews lived under Roman occupation and had few choices. Some turned fishermen, others artisans, and still others, including Matthew, chose the route of tax collector, fully aware of the cost to their names. But even standing at the top of the world, behind all his affluence and authority, something was still missing. There was a void that money couldn't fill. But then one day, things took a turn. It was a day like any other. Matthew was at his station at the tax booth, counting coins, dealings with merchants and traders. The air was full as always with the sounds of the marketplace, voices haggling, money clinking, some grumbled complaints among those who objected to paying taxes. Then a presence approached, a man whose name was beginning to circulate like wildfire: Jesus. Instead of getting away from tax collectors as the religious leaders did, when Matthew stood up, Jesus actually looked him in the face. And then, speaking with authority yet compassion, he said 2 words: "Follow me." It was pure destiny in the moment. No explanation, no debate, just an invitation. For someone like Matthew, who had spent years being hated, this was jarring. Jesus, a rabbi, a teacher, was calling him, the exact kind of man that the religious leaders reviled. But something awakened inside Matthew. He jumped up, left his wealth behind, and followed Jesus. Mark 10:21. Why Matthew of all the people Jesus could have picked? Why choose a tax collector when you could have so many other people who were more glitzy to the eyes of the world? The truth is a profound one. Jesus didn't come for the righteous. He came for the lost. He came for those who needed saving, the lost, those rejected, those deemed unworthy. Matthew's story is evidence that grace can reach anyone. He had gone from a man who collected taxes to a man who collected souls for the kingdom of God. When Matthew decided to follow Jesus, his life changed course dramatically. He did not just watch miracles happen. He reported on them. He listened to what Jesus taught, the parables that he told, the way that he treated people. Many years later, inspired by the heavens, Matthew would compose what became known as the Gospel of Matthew, the first book of the New Testament. His gospel would serve as a bridge between the Old Testament prophecies and their fulfillment in Jesus Christ. His gospel was formulated with one purpose: to prove to the Jewish people that Jesus was the Messiah, the one prophesied in their writings. But that was just the start. There's concealed insight in Matthew's tale that most scholars missed. There are deep mysteries, hard lessons, and insights to unpack. So what was Matthew's life like truly before Jesus called him? What secrets are hidden in the gospel according to Matthew? How did Matthew's distinct perspective affect his telling of Jesus' life? What became of Matthew after the resurrection? And we will unearth these secrets as we trek through his story. Now, before you proceed, take a moment to support this channel. Don't forget to subscribe to Bible Says and click the notification bell for the upcoming episodes. If you like this deep dive, consider sending a super thanks to support bringing more videos like this. Now let us delve deeper into the life of Matthew and the secrets waiting to unfold. Matthew's life was filled with contradictions. A man who seemed to have all but nothing simultaneously. At his tax booth in bustling Capernaum, he was counting silver coins he had bought that cost him the trust and love of his own people. His name, at one time Levi, now suggested he was a traitor in the eyes of other Jews. Tax collectors were despised, traitors, men who worked for the oppressive empire of Rome, who made a fortune while their suffering brothers and sisters lost everything. Matthew wasn't just another tax collector, though. He was one of the most successful, installed at a pivotal trading post where traders passed through daily. He was an expert negotiator and knew human avarice well, and had fashioned a luxurious existence for himself. But during those times of tender solitude, when the streets were devoid of the language of a busy day and the pain of his own life was all he heard, didn't he ever feel an emptier emptiness? One thing was clear. Nobody believed him. The religious elite from the Pharisees looked upon him with disdain. Common people avoided him. He was the rich kid, but it felt like an outcast. But then one day, an encounter altered everything. There was a thick stir of voices in Capernaum, merchants vocalizing their trade, the occasional clash of coins changing hands for goods. And in the middle of it all, a man approached Matthew's booth. Jesus. He was different from anyone they had ever known. He was not like the religious leaders who would not even look in Matthew's direction. There was neither judgment nor disdain in his eyes, only a quiet certainty. And then, with a voice that appeared to pierce through the marketing cacophony, he said, "Follow me." No explanations, no accusations, just an invitation. Matthew froze. Had he heard correctly? Had this rabbi really just called him a tax collector? He looked around. Nearby, other men, fishermen and traders, stared aghast. Rabbi did not befriend tax collectors, it was unthinkable. But Jesus had spoken to him. And at that moment something broke inside Matthew. Maybe it was the long accumulation of being unwanted, of a life lived in material gain, but spiritual loss. Or perhaps it was the very fact that for the first time in years, someone looked at him and saw more than a sinner. He stood up without a second of hesitation. The very coins he had cherished so dearly were now left scattered on the table. The life he had constructed, the security he had clutched to, all of it. He walked away. He followed Jesus. It was not an easy decision. Giving up tax collecting was giving up on a powerful position one few could claim. It meant losing wealth, losing protection, entering a realm where he didn't know what would be waiting for him. And still, Matthew was unfazed. He didn't just leave, he threw a party. That night he would throw a party in his home. Not only Jesus and his disciples, but other tax collectors and outcasts. If Jesus was willing to embrace him, then maybe others could find that same grace. But not everyone was pleased. Outside, the religious figures whispered to each other. They did not understand why Jesus, a teacher of God's law, would decide to eat with tax collectors and sinners. The righteous would not do this. And thus, they challenged his disciples. "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" Jesus heard them, and his response was simple but profound. "It is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. For I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners." It was a statement that rocked the core of religious philosophy. Opinionated others viewed Matthew as a lost cause, but Jesus saw opportunity. Where others saw a sinner, he saw a disciple. But that evening, Matthew came to a realization. He was not limited by his previous life. His failures did not disqualify him from God's calling, but a disciple, not a convert. For Matthew, discipleship wasn't merely about leaving the old life, but also entering into something that meant more than anything else. He was no longer merely a tax collector. He was a disciple now, one of the chosen 12, but it wasn't easy to adjust to this new life. Among the other disciples were fishermen, men of humble backgrounds, but great loyalty to their people. Some, like Simon the Zealot, had actively resisted Roman rule. He had once been part of a group that fought against it, and now they would have to welcome a former tax collector as their fellow believer in the brotherhood of faith. Did they trust him right away? Likely not. It must have taken time for the past wounds to heal, time also for Matthew to demonstrate he was no longer the man who had once sold out his people for money. But Jesus trusted him, and that trust was enough. Matthew had long been gaudily imagination in numbers, transactions, and taxes. Now, he would document something much broader. He began as a bystander, watching and hearing the words and miracles of Jesus. Every parable, every teaching, he absorbed with the mind of a man who had spent a lifetime in detail. Maybe that's why years later he ended up writing the Gospel of Matthew. His past, long viewed as a curse, became a blessing. His talent for documenting the details, once used in tax work, was now used to spread the good news of salvation. The man who once had stolen from people was now giving them the greatest gift of all, the truth. And this was only the first. The Gospel according to Matthew differs from all of the other three Gospels in a multitude of ways. All four accounts tell the story of Jesus, but Matthew's is triply structured, intentional, weighted specifically to address a Jewish audience. Unlike Mark, who emphasizes action, or Luke, who emphasizes Jesus' compassion for all people, Matthew slowly and methodically makes the case that Jesus is the Messiah, the Greek word for the Hebrew word Messiah, that God had called and waited for Israel. Every parable, prophecy, and teaching he includes has a goal: to demonstrate Jesus as the fulfillment of the Hebrew Scriptures. Matthew had been a tax collector, so he had an analytical mind, used to keeping precise records. His ear for ordering events is evident in the organization of his gospel. It is not a hodgepodge, but rather a structured narrative with 5 major discourses, a parallel to the 5 books of the Torah. For a Jewish reader, this structure would not have been missed, drawing a careful link between Jesus and Moses, Israel's lawgiver par excellence. Matthew wanted readers to consider Jesus not an outsider bringing a new religion, but the true interpreter of the law and the prophets. Matthew repeats the phrase so that it might be fulfilled, almost particular when he matches the act of Jesus. More than any other gospel writer, he ties the life of Jesus to the Old Testament prophecies. When Jesus is born in Bethlehem, Matthew links it to the prophecy of Micah. When he is brought into Egypt, Matthew remembers what Hosea said, "Out of Egypt I called my son." Even minute details, like the fact that Jesus taught in parables, are tied back to prophetic writings. His Jewish readers desperately needed this focus on prophecy. Although in Israel many were awaiting the coming Messiah, they were expecting a king who would restore them as a nation politically. Matthew's challenge was to prove that Jesus was, in fact, the Messiah, just not the kind they had expected. He was the real king, but his kingdom was not of this world. He was the new Moses, liberating not from Roman oppression, but from sin. Matthew's Gospel opens with a genealogy which asserts Jesus' descent from Abraham and David. This was not mere historical record. This was a statement. Lineage meant something to a Jewish audience. The Messiah was to be of the line of David, and Matthew left us in no doubt that Jesus qualified here. But his genealogy also contained unexpected names: women, Gentiles, and even sinners like Rahab and Tamar. This pointed to a deeper message. Jesus came not only for Israel, but for everyone. Another unique aspect of Matthew's Gospel is its emphasis on Jesus as a teacher. Among the Gospel writers, Matthew overall presents long and structured sermons of Jesus' teaching. The Sermon on the Mount is the most famous of these, where Jesus sets forth the principles of his kingdom. For Jewish readers of the time who knew the story of Moses going up on Mount Sinai to receive the law, this would have been a powerful scene. Jesus, like Moses, delivering a divine teaching, this time, however, with an authority greater than the very law he came to fulfill. Matthew also pays special attention to the tension between Jesus and the Pharisees. The Pharisees as seen as the religious elite, the law experts, yet Jesus challenged them over and over. He charged them with prioritizing visible rights over the essence of God's commandments: justice, mercy, and faithfulness. As someone who had once been an outcast himself, perhaps Matthew knew better than anyone that righteousness was about transformation rather than appearances. One of the most remarkable features of Matthew's Gospel is how it concludes. Matthew's last words are a commission, while the ending of Mark's Gospel is super abrupt and Luke's Gospel has an emphasis on the ascension. Jesus, standing with his disciples, states, "Go therefore and make disciples of all nations." This is a profoundly appropriate conclusion for a gospel with such intense Jewish contents. This indicates a change, that the message of Jesus, once understood to be limited to Israel, was now for the whole world. Matthew also highlights Jesus' royal background by quoting his genealogy from King David. This was important, as Jewish prophecy had for centuries predicted that the Messiah would be descended from David. David was given this covenant, 2 Samuel 7:16, in which God promised that David's line would reign forever. During the many years of occupation and oppression of the Jewish people, this prophecy became a promise of hope. The faithful were waiting for a son of David who would rebuild their kingdom. Matthew, for example, portrays Jesus as the fulfillment of this hope, but in a manner that subverted usual hopes. He was not coming to found an earthly kingdom, but a heavenly one. One of the most remarkable features of Matthew's genealogy is that it is divided into 3 sets of 14 generations. This is not accidental. In Jewish numerology, specific numbers have symbolic meaning, and 14 in particular has importance. In Hebrew, each letter has a numerical value, and the name David equals 14. Matthew's structuring of the genealogy in this way reaffirms the notion that Jesus is the legitimate heir to the throne of David. 这是文字中的一个微妙而强大的信息. He lists Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, and Bathsheba, whom he refers to as the wife of Uriah. All of these women had complex, not to mention scandalous, stories. Tamar dressed up to claim her rightful place in the lineage of Judah, a Gentile and former prostitute who assisted Israel. Rahab. Ruth was a Moabite, an outsider invited into Israel's story. Bathsheba had a tumultuous, scandalous relationship with David. As such, their invitation into Jesus' genealogy is significant. It means that God's plan was never just for the elite or the pure, but for everyone, especially the broken and the outcasts. This genealogy also has a hidden prophecy in it, one that only reveals itself with a close look at the Old Testament. In 2 Samuel 7, God makes David a promise that his kingdom will be established forever. But following David's reign, Israel experienced cycles of sin, exile, and foreign domination. It appeared that the throne of David was gone. Most thought the prophecy had been false, but Matthew's genealogy shows that God's promise was not dead. Jesus is the son of David, and in fact the royal line continued in Jesus despite all the attempts to stamp it out through persecution, oppression, etc. The concealed prophecy told that the kingdom of the Messiah would be spiritual, not political. Jesus was not on his way to reign with an army, but to establish God's eternal kingdom in the hearts of men. Matthew's genealogy also highlights the Babylonian exile, a low point in Jewish history. The reminder of this exile is seen as another confirmation that even at their lowest, God's promises do not desert. Similar to the exile and restoration of Israel, Matthew is indicating that Jesus is making possible a new kind of restoration. And this restoration is not limited to Israel, but offers a new hope for all of humanity. In purposefully compiling his genealogy and in pointing to prophetic connections, Matthew is doing more than providing a record of names. He is telling a story. One about divine promise, faithfulness, and fulfillment. He's not just another in a long line of kings. He is the king history has anticipated. His coming marks the dawn of a fresh start, but one whose roots can be traced back thousands of years to the ancient promises of God in days gone by. The Sermon on the Mount represents one of the greatest and most profound teachings of Jesus found in the book of Matthew. And not only was it a normal speech, but it was also a proclamation of a new life, one that contradicted common belief systems and brought forth a divine standard that exceeded the expectations of humanity. This sermon, delivered on a mountainside, immediately conjured parallels with Moses receiving the Ten Commandments on Mount Sinai. Whereas Moses came with laws written on tablets of stone, Jesus spoke straight into the hearts of the people and unveiled the true character of God's will. At the very center of this sermon lies the Beatitudes, a set of blessings that seem on the surface to contradict common wisdom. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. This phrase has been interpreted incorrectly many times over. It does not mean that material poverty is a good in and of itself, nor that suffering should be sought after. Rather, it attests to a deeper truth. Those who know they are spiritually poor, who do not depend on their own merit, but on God's grace, are the ones who will really possess the kingdom. He spoke as one who was well aware of the external manifestations of success in a world dominated by power, wealth, and self-sufficiency. There is great meaning in each of the Beatitudes. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. It is not simply grieving and mourning over loss to self, but grieving what happened throughout the world: sin, injustice, suffering. It is a summons to see the suffering not as a curse, but as something that binds people closer to God. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Jesus stood in contrast to the norms of a society where dominance, aggression, and self-promotion were often perceived as strengths, by calling into question many of these values and showing how true power comes in surrender to God's will, humbling ourselves before others, even our enemies, and servanthood rather than domination. The Sermon on the Mount was no mundane handbook of ethics translation. This was a subversive message that rearranged the meaning of righteousness. When Jesus came to address the Pharisees, the religious leaders of his day, he is most often seen as attacking their focus on external obedience to the law, rule after rule, ritual after ritual. But Jesus was indicating something deeper. You have heard that it was said, but I tell you, he said. With these few words, he took laws that were familiar to them and showed their true intention in a spiritual sense. It was not merely a refusal to murder, but a prevention of rage. This is more than the absence of adultery. This is purity of heart. That is, when Jesus said all of these things, he was not abolishing the law. He was fulfilling it, bringing out its final aim. Another remarkable thing about this sermon was how much it focused on love and mercy. Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. This is such a radical idea that it runs completely counter to humanity's natural instinct towards vengeance. In Jewish law, justice was equitable. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. But Jesus set a higher standard that reflected the very character of God. The objective wasn't so that injustice could go unchallenged, but that the cycle of hatred and retribution would be interrupted by love. The sermon also spoke to religious hypocrisy. Jesus cautioned about doing the acts of righteousness for public visibility. He spoke of prayer, fasting, and charity as things to be done in secret, only for God. It was a direct challenge to the religious elite who often used their piety to elevate their social status. Jesus taught that true devotion was not about external display, but an internal metamorphosis. Some of the sermon's most famous material is the Lord's Prayer, the template for coming before God. It starts with Our Father, highlighting a relational view of God, not one out of fear or distance. It asks for God's will to be done on earth as it is in heaven, aligning what humans want with what is divine purpose. It requests daily sustenance, not lavish riches and forgiveness, but ties it to one's attitude toward forgiving others. Each word in this prayer is a piece of meaning that influences the way believers think about their relationship with God. Jesus also talked about what we have with us, what we own, warning us to not store up treasures on earth. No one can be a slave of two masters, he taught. Only evil can come from attempting to be 100% committed to God and 100% committed to wealth. This was not a denunciation of material success, but a reminder that real safety and real happiness do not flow from things. The treasure is in the kingdom of God, which cannot be robbed by circumstances. Maybe the most difficult thing about the sermon was its ending, the motivation to act. Jesus did not just preach beautiful ideals, he required a response. Enter through the narrow gate, he said, making clear that sticking with him would not be the easy way or the popular way. To tread the way of righteousness was no easy ride. It required dedication and sacrifice. He spoke of false prophets, those who were righteous in appearance, but who deceived people away from the truth. And finally, he ended with the well-known story of the wise and foolish builders. Those who build their lives on his words will stand firm like a house built on rock, whereas those who lived in disregard of his teachings would fall flat like a house built on sand. This was no ordinary sermon. It was a heavenly revelation, one that would transform the nature of belief and goodness. It gave not new rules, but demanded new hearts. Through it, Jesus unveiled a vision of God's reign unlike anything seen before, the only one built upon love, humility, mercy, and unending trust in God. Jesus frequently spoke in parables, short tales with spiritual significance. These stories were indirect guidance, and thus had a deeper meaning than what was explicitly stated, which required one to think and reflect about what it actually meant. Why did Jesus use parables when he could have just said what he meant? The answer can be found in prophecy and purpose. Jesus did not merely want to speak in endless lists of agendas and theological point formations, though they were all true, but rather, he spoke in those familiar parables to release revelatory power to those willing to hear him. Even Jesus himself explained this reasoning in the Gospel of Matthew. When his disciples questioned him about why he spoke in parables, he answered them, "Because the knowledge of the secrets of the kingdom of heaven has been given to you, but not to them." That statement indicates that not the same way was who his word for. Those with open hearts, those who really wanted to know the truth, would realize what was happening, while those who were spiritually blind would continue to wonder. So was fulfilled what was spoken through the prophet Isaiah. "You will be ever hearing, but never understanding. You will be ever seeing, but never perceiving. Thou art not a corner where thou be the undemanding passing God on the mirror I see and being. Thou art the Bible that separates the wheat from the chaff of people, indifferent and opposed to or with some opposition to revelation from those who yearn to know God." Perhaps one of the most famous parables is the parable of the sower. In this story, a farmer sows seeds on various kinds of ground. Some land on a path and are eaten by birds. Some land on rocky soil, where they sprout quickly but die. Some in thorns that choke them. And some in good soil that blooms and produces a harvest. This parable demonstrates the different responses to God's word. Some hear and soon forget. Some hear and receive it superficially, but fall away in tests. Some are distracted by worldly distractions, but some hear, receive, and bear spiritual fruit. In this simple story, Jesus disclosed profound truth about human nature and how different people respond to the message of God. The parable of the mustard seed is another well-known parable. Jesus said that the kingdom of heaven is like a little mustard seed that grows into a big tree. It conveyed that God's kingdom would be begun small but grow to the unimaginable. Something that to begin with looked insubstantial would actually be a home and a sanctuary for lots of people. This was an impactful message, and especially for his disciples, who were a small band being subjected to a lot of criticism. It assured them that their faith and hard work would not be wasted. The lost sheep parable reminds us that God loves each of us dearly. In this story, a shepherd abandons 99 sheep to seek out a wayward sheep. This shows God's heart for those who have drifted away and his desire to draw them back, regardless of how far they may have strayed. It assures that no one is too small for God's grace and that his love is meant for every human, with all their past wrongs. The parable of the prodigal son goes even deeper into this theme. A young man asks for his inheritance early, squanders it in riotous living, and hits bottom. Upon returning home, so prepared for punishment, his father welcomes him with open arms, celebrating his return. This parable also captures a rich picture of God's forgiveness. The older brother in the story, who resents the father's mercy, stands for the self-righteous who cannot grasp that God's grace is offered to everyone, not just to those who assume they've earned it. Judgment and accountability were also covered by Jesus through parables. In the parable of the wise and foolish virgins, we learn of 10 bridesmaids waiting for a wedding banquet. 5 have enough oil for their lamps, and the other 5 are unprepared and miss out on the event. This highlights the need for spiritual preparedness. Those who are prepared for the kingdom of God will be admitted. Those who are careless will be excluded. Just the same, the parable of the talents teaches a lesson about responsibility. A master entrusts his servants to varying amounts of money before traveling. 2 of them invest and multiply what they were given, and the third hides it out of fear. In spite of the master's absence, the first 2 servants invest the money wisely, and when the master returns, he rewards them and punishes the third for squandering the opportunity. The message is fairly straightforward. God has given people talents and resources and expects them to use them responsibly instead of being paralyzed by fear or laziness. Jesus was not only telling stories through parables, he was preaching eternal truths, but in such a way that they would have to be wrestled with. Those who sincerely searched for wisdom would read them for meaning, while the indifferent would shrug and say they were just stories. This way, his instruction would be delivered to those who were spiritually willing and also concealed to those who turned a deaf ear. These parables yield great depth, revealing insight after insight to those willing to glean the story with an open heart, century after century. Jesus' message challenged the established religious and political order from the very beginning of his ministry. What he was describing didn't quite fit into the ordinary empires of the world or the rigid ordeals of the religious traditionalists. He talked about the kingdom of heaven, a rule of the divine, and yet his message was terrifying for the ruling and privileged classes. His teachings were a disruption to their lives. The only authority to which the Roman Empire, which ruled Judea with an iron fist, would be beholden was that of the emperor. So any mention of a new kingdom would be seen as treasonous at two levels. Likewise, the Jewish religious authorities, especially the Pharisees and Sadducees, feared that Jesus was usurping their authority over the people. I mean, right after he talks about the Pharisees, who imposed a stringent interpretation of the law and believed righteousness was obtained through adherence to the minutiae of religious law. They were leaders in their synagogues and greatly esteemed by the people. But Jesus publicly condemned them for hypocrisy. He accused them of making the people bear laws that they themselves did not fully observe. Logging the flaunted piety, but lack of mercy and justice, he made the religious hierarchy's hypocrisy clear. However, over time, this confrontation bred a bitter hatred between Jesus and the religious leaders of his day, who perceived him to be dangerous and whose actions could stir the people against them. The Sadducees were a party of the elite who operated the temple and worked with the Romans to stay in power. The Pharisees, on the other hand, which was the dominant group for most of the duration of the Second Temple period, were not just interpreters of the Torah, but held to a number of Jewish beliefs, from the resurrection of the dead to a theological belief in angels. Jesus had contradicted them by raising the dead and by preaching the resurrection. This, together with his increasing popularity, made them see him as a genuine threat to their influence. The Roman Empire cared little for Jewish religious squabbles, but was very sensitive to potential stability disruptions. Order in Judea was maintained by the governor Pontius Pilate. Any movement that looked like it would challenge Roman authority was crushed as soon as it started. Although Jesus did not preach insurrection, the swelling number of his followers alarmed the authorities. The notion of a kingdom independent of Roman rule was dangerous in their minds. From the world's perspective, as king, if the people moved to believe Jesus was their true king, they may have refused to be ruled by Rome and potentially staged uprisings against the ruling powers. The final confrontation of Jesus with the Jewish authorities in the temple, Jerusalem. As Passover drew near, thousands of Jews from around the world had arrived in the city. Jesus went into the temple and threw down the tables of the money changers, and he said they had made God's house a den of thieves. The temple, which was not just a place of prayer, but a pivotal hub of economic life that the Sadducees once held in their distant grip, was a direct challenge to the religious establishment. This only increased their desire to kill him. That was a wrong persuasion of the Pharisees and Sadducees, coming up with questions to trick Jesus so that Jesus would be ashamed in front of the people. They, to force him in a dilemma, asked him if it were lawful to pay taxes to Caesar, and if he said yes, he would alienate those who despised the Roman tax. If he said no, he could be charged with insurrection. Jesus answered with wisdom by saying to them, "Render therefore to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's." When he answered them, no one was able to give them an answer, nor to say anything. They tried again, this time asking him which commandment in the law is the greatest. Jesus said the most important commandment of all was to love God with all one's heart, soul, and mind, and the second most important was to love one's neighbor as oneself. This answer not only summarized the essence of the law of God, but also revealed the inability of the religious leaders to follow that law. Instead of getting lost in obscure legalistic particulars, Jesus pointed instead to the substance of faith, something the Pharisees had neglected for a very long time. Though each one their attempts to capture him had failed, the religious rulers understood Jesus needed to become silenced. They were afraid that his kingdom would grow beyond their ability to contain. They wanted to seize him, but could not find an opportunity because of the people. And one of Jesus' own disciples, Judas Iscariot, betrayed him for silver. That provided them the opening they required. When Jesus prayed in the Garden of Gethsemane, Roman soldiers and temple guards came to arrest him. They took Jesus before the Jewish council, called the Sanhedrin, and there he was accused of blasphemy for saying he was the Son of God. This was the supreme offense for the high priest and other religious leaders. But they lacked the power to carry out the death sentence, so they turned him over to Romans, portraying him as a political danger and not a religious one. Jesus stood before Pilate, accused of claiming to be king of the Jews, an act that could be interpreted as rebellion against Rome, for he found no real crime in him, Pilate. And he tried to free Jesus himself, giving the mob a choice between Jesus or Barabbas, a known criminal. The crowd, swayed by the religious authorities, demanded that Barabbas be released. Reluctantly, but with less conviction than above, Pilate surrendered to their request and condemned Jesus to be crucified. The crucifixion was more than an execution. It was intended as a public display of Rome's power. Crucifixion was a punishment that was only reserved to treat the worst of criminals, and by crucifying Jesus, they believed they were sending a message. They thought that if they killed him, they would kill his movement. That they have decided to bury his life, his teachings, and the faith of his followers. Jesus was never feared for his rebellious acts. He never raised an army, nor did he engage in political ambition. The actual fear was contained in his message. He preached a kingdom whose foundation of stone was not that of oppression, but of righteousness and mercy and truth. This was directly contrary to the systems of power possessed by the Romans as well as the Jewish aristocrats. His words questioned the status quo in a way that neither group could afford not to hear. Judas Iscariot, one of Christian history's most infamous figures, is remembered for his betrayal of Jesus, selling him for 30 pieces of silver. His is a name now synonymous with treachery, but the motivations for his actions are a matter of intense debate. Why would Judas, who devoted years to following Jesus, betray him for what seems like a small price? And why did Matthew, whose gospel emphasizes this betrayal so heavily? The number, 30 pieces of silver, isn't an arbitrary sum. It has a powerful symbolic and prophetic significance. It comes from the Old Testament, where 30 pieces of silver was the price set to buy a slave in the book of Exodus. If an ox killed a slave, the owner was to be compensated with 30 silver coins. This detail is important because it reflects the low value Judas put on Jesus. He asked no riches or power in exchange for his treachery. He contented himself with the price of an ordinary slave. This was not mere greed, but a fulfillment of prophecy. Matthew links this betrayal to the prophecy of Zechariah. The prophet wrote, "They took the 30 coins of silver, the value of the man with the price set on him, and gave them to God, and threw them into the temple for the potter." This served as a foreshadowing of events after Judas's regret, when he returned the money to the temple and then took his own life. No New Testament writer makes such a strong case that these events are couched in ancient prophecies and are proof that everything occurred in accordance with a divine plan, quite like Matthew. The question that remains is, why did Judas betray Jesus? Others claim he was disillusioned. He may have expected Jesus to set up a political kingdom, overthrowing Roman rule and re-establishing Israel's independence. When Jesus preached instead about a spiritual kingdom, Judas might have become frustrated, convinced his leader had no serious plan for power. Some have speculated that Judas's motivation was greed. The Gospels say that he was in charge of the disciples' money and liked to steal from it. If so, then his behavior was merely the last act in a long string of selfishness. Matthew recounts in heartbreaking detail the moment of the betrayal. When Jesus was praying in the Garden of Gethsemane before his arrest, Judas showed up with a band of armed men. The signal we'd agreed on was a kiss, a common form of greeting in Jewish culture. Then Judas came up to Jesus at once and said, "Rabbi," and he kissed him. It would have been unremarkable had it not come with a show of affection. "What came you for, friend?" Jesus said sadly but firmly. The betrayal was complete. The soldiers arrested Jesus, and the frightened disciples fled. But for Judas, the burden of his actions soon became too much to bear. When he saw that Jesus was condemned, Matthew says he was filled with remorse. You have seen it in how he went back to the temple and attempted to give the money back to the chief priests and elders, affirming that he had betrayed innocent blood. So why did the religious rulers, who had used him for their own purposes, dismiss his guilt? They explained that it was his problem, not theirs. Judas was filled with remorse and returned the 30 pieces of silver in the temple before leaving. Several years later, feeling guilty, he took his own life. The chief priests, confronted with a problem of what to do with the money, concluded that it could not be deposited in the temple treasury because it represented blood money. Then instead of refunding the money, they used it to purchase the potter's field so that it could serve as a burial place for strangers, a direct fulfillment of what the prophet Zechariah wrote. Matthew's gospel frames this entire sequence as a divinely ordained development of events. Every step, every choice, even Judas's bitter fate, is in accordance with prophetic words given hundreds of years ago. It wasn't merely some act of human weakness. It was a vital cog in the great plan that would lead to Jesus' death. The amount, the method, and the aftermath all had symbolic significance, underscoring the notion that nothing happened by chance. Judas's tale isn't just one of betrayal, but wasted regret and lost salvation. Unlike Peter, who denied Jesus, but later found forgiveness, Judas never sought restoration. His guilt deteriorated him to ruin. His worst mistake wasn't just betraying Jesus, but thinking that his sin was unforgivable. The crucifixion of Jesus is in the center of Matthew's gospel, with deep spiritual and historical importance. It was not simply an execution, but rather an event that altered the trajectory of human destiny. Among all the details, a particularly striking one Matthew shares is the cry of Jesus on the cross. "Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani?" My God, why have you forsaken me?" Last words. Spoken in his final moments, these words have been deeply reflected upon and debated by many. What did Jesus truly mean? A wail of anguish, or something deeper, something buried? Understanding this moment requires looking at its context. Jesus had already suffered greatly: betrayal, humiliation, torture, and now the slow agony of crucifixion. Darkness had engulfed the land for 3 hours, a sign that something beyond the physical was playing out. And then, in his last strength, he spoke. The words sounded like he was calling for Elijah, and so many who heard him thought that was who he was calling. but Jesus was actually quoting the first verse of Psalm 22, a passage that prophetically detailed his suffering in astonishing detail. Even Psalm 22, composed almost a millennium earlier, describes a righteous man who is humiliated, whose hands and feet are pierced, and whose clothing is cast lots for, details that match the crucifixion of Jesus to a T. By quoting this psalm, Jesus was fulfilling his agony and simultaneously pointing the scripture-aware audience around him to the fact that, in this moment, the prophecy was being fulfilled. Despite beginning with a cry of abandonment, the psalm finishes in triumph, proclaiming that suffering would have final victory. But Matthew also highlights the supernatural phenomena surrounding the crucifixion, emphasizing its heavenly significance. When Jesus breathed his last, the veil of the temple, the great curtain that divided the Holy of Holies from the rest of the temple, was rent from top to bottom. This was no ordinary event. The Holy of Holies was the inner chamber of the tabernacle, the most sacred place in Jewish worship, into which only the high priest could enter once a year to offer sacrifices on behalf of the people's sins. This tearing of the veil represented the destruction of the old order. We see here that the barrier to God, which up until this moment had been only open to priests and sacrifices, was torn down. The death of Jesus had opened a new way, and a great earthquake shook the land, splitting rocks and opening graves. After Jesus' resurrection, Matthew records that many holy people who had died were raised to life and appeared to others. It was an incredible event, confirming that Jesus' death was not the end, but the start of the most amazing family on earth, his church. Even the ground responded to his atonement, attesting to its value. Matthew's account also describes the reaction of witnesses to these events. It was too much for the Roman centurion and his men, toughened men, who must have overseen many crucifixions, who were overwhelmed by what they saw. The darkness, the earthquake, and Jesus' final words caused them to say, "Truly, this was the Son of God." They were not followers of Jesus, nor were they versed in Jewish prophecies, but even they knew something extraordinary had unfolded. Jesus' crucifixion, not simply punishment, but the final sacrifice. Throughout the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus is the one who fulfills Old Testament prophecies, the suffering servant of Isaiah. His death was neither an accident nor a defeat. It was the fulfillment of his mission. He had come to lay down his life as a ransom for many, to take the burden of mankind's sins on himself. This sacrifice is not only important in the moment, it transformed the nature of salvation from a legalistic relationship, defined in terms of laws and rituals, to one defined in terms of grace. This act lifted the burden of sin, which was the bond that separated humanity from God. By his suffering, Jesus had closed this gap, not just for a chosen people, but for all who would believe. Matthew's Gospel, which paints Jesus as the fulfillment of prophecy, peaks, like a loosely coordinated campaign, in the crucifixion, which it casts as the apogee of a divine scheme that began long before everything. Every detail, the words heard, the events, the reactions of those present, speaks to something much larger than the death of a man. It was the instant that altered eternity. The greatest miracle recorded in the Gospel of Matthew is the resurrection of Jesus Christ. It is the single event that altered everything, the final defeat of death, the affirmation of his divine purpose, the cornerstone of the Christian faith. Unlike the crucifixion, which many people witnessed, the resurrection was a private affair, revealed only to a few in the beginning. Its hiddenness did not, however, make it insignificant. Its effects rippled through the Roman authorities, the Jewish leaders, and the followers of Jesus. After Jesus was buried in the tomb, the Jewish chief priests and Pharisees were highly troubled. They had succeeded in what they thought was their goal. Jesus was dead, and his disciples should be done with him, but they were reminded of something important. Jesus had foretold his own resurrection. He had openly spoken, declaring, "After 3 days, I will rise again." The religious leaders were concerned that his disciples would use this prophecy as an opportunity to steal his remains and fake his resurrection to prove to the people that he was still alive. Concerned this might happen, they went to Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor, and asked for additional security at the tomb. Pilate complied and decreed that the grave should be sealed and guarded by Roman soldiers. The Roman military was characterized by discipline and brutal efficiency. Regular dudes wouldn't have stood a chance against them. This eliminated the chance, as far as humans are concerned, that any of the disciples of Jesus had stolen his body. The religious leaders thought they had won their battle. The tomb was sealed, the guards were on post. No deception would be possible. But what followed was beyond anything they had prepared for, without anything they could have controlled. Matthew says that on the 3rd day at dawn, there was a violent earthquake. This was not a passing tremor. It was a supernatural event that signaled the turning of history. Epoch, a great earth-shaking and diamond-sparkling, like the rod of God's angel come from the heaven. He appeared like lightning, his garments white as snow. It's with a divine power that he rolled away the huge stone sealing the tomb, not to free Jesus, but to show that he was already out. It was sight enough to have even the Roman guards, seasoned men who had probably seen death and battle half a dozen times, tremble with disgust. Matthew depicts them shaking in fear and collapsing to the ground like dead men. These were seasoned soldiers who could stand and face down an enemy in battle, but in the presence of this angel, they were utterly powerless. But as the guards were shaken with terror, the angel addressed the women who had come to the tomb. Mary Magdalene and the other Mary had arrived, presumably with spices to anoint Jesus' body, still grieving the terrible events of the crucifixion. Instead of a sealed tomb, they encountered the heavenly messenger who delivered a message that would alter the course of human history forever. The angel said to the women, "Do not be afraid, for I know that you are looking for Jesus who was crucified. He is not here. He has risen, as he said." Then he invited them to go inside the tomb and see for themselves that it was empty. Imagine the emotions they must have experienced in that moment. Shock, confusion, hope, and awe all colliding at once. Jesus, who they'd seen die with their own eyes, was alive. It sounded impossible, but here was an angel bringing the message with undeniable authority. 5. The angel said to the women, "Do not be afraid." 63. "For I know that you seek Jesus." 64. "Who was crucified." 6. "He is not here. He has risen." 65. "As he said, come see the place where he lay." 7. "And go quickly and tell his disciples." 66. "He has risen from the dead and is gone before you into Galilee. He will see you there. There you will see him." And in so doing, the women became the first witnesses to the resurrection. Not powerful kings, not the religious elite, not even the disciples, but 2 faithful women. The women rushed out to spread the word, a combination of dread and exhilaration filling them. But when they ran, something amazing happened. Jesus showed up in front of them. "Greetings," he said. In that moment, all doubt must have disappeared. He was right in front of them. Not a ghost, not a vision, but the real, living Jesus. They fell at his feet and worshiped him, overcome with emotion. This wasn't just their teacher or their friend. This was the risen Son of God. Jesus comforted them, echoing what the angel had told them. "Do not be afraid. Go and tell my brothers to go to Galilee. There you will see me." With that, He verified his resurrection and prepared the way for the next chapter of his mission. As the women ran to tell the good news, the Roman guards were in a predicament. They had seen something they couldn't comprehend or describe. If they claimed the body had vanished as a result of divine intervention, they faced dire punishment. Under Roman law, a soldier could be punished by death for failing in his duty. So then they obviously cannot lie to the guards and went to the chief priests instead of Pilate in a desperate attempt to suppress the truth. The religious leaders, now facing hard evidence of Jesus' resurrection, found themselves with a problem. To confirm that this event became known, that was Jesus, the Messiah. So they devised a plan. They bribed the guards a small fortune, telling them to spread a lie. Say, his disciples came at night and stole him away while we were asleep. This story was deeply flawed. First, if the guards were asleep, how would they know who stole the body? Second, why did trained Roman soldiers allow a small band of fishermen to overpower them? But if those contradictions seem to contradict each other, the workers' bribe is enough to make the guards agree. The religious authorities promised to protect them from Pilate's anger should the story reach Roman ears. Matthew warns that this fake news went out among the Jews, so that, he says, this was one of the reasons which showed how desperate were the authorities to cover over the truth. After the resurrection, Jesus met up with his disciples, as he had promised, in Galilee. At that point, he gave them a command that would define the future of his followers. All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all things I have commanded you. It is the Great Commission in the moment when Jesus made his mission, go beyond the people of Israel to all nations. Not only was his resurrection not just about his victory over death, it was about the birth of a new kingdom, a new movement, a new mission that would blanket fruition across the globe. Matthew's narrative of the resurrection stands out because it not only affirms Jesus' victory over death, but also reveals the battle against the truth. The chief priests and the Roman authorities attempted to suppress it, but that was of no avail. The resurrection was not just an event, it was the fulcrum of history. It meant death was not the end, that sin had been vanquished, that Jesus' message was vindicated. It was a declaration from heaven that his mission had not failed. Rather, it had only just begun. The Gospel of Matthew is not just a historical record of the life, teachings, and miracles of Jesus. It is a generation with knowledge, with wisdom, with messages which were not only for people of that age, but also far greater relevance to this very age. The spirit of Matthew's words is nuance, and they carry messages that are only unveiled to those who take the time to get into the nitty-gritty. Was his gospel written just for first-century Jews, or does it still teach us lessons for today's world? Is the notion of the kingdom of heaven still relevant in the world we live in today? And perhaps most crucially, was Matthew's writing a thing of such deeper knowledge that only a few could bind to body? At first glance, Matthew's gospel appears to be firmly embedded in the Jewish context of the time. He organized it to appeal to his audience, citing Old Testament prophecies, portraying Jesus as the fulfillment of the Jewish hope, and stressing how he was the offspring of Abraham and David. His main audience was the Jewish people who were hoping for their Messiah, and Matthew sought to prove to them that Jesus was in fact the one they had been waiting for. But if Matthew's gospel was never intended for the likes of us, why do people 2,000 years later find it challenging us? Why do billions of people around the world still look to it for guidance? The answer is in the substance of Jesus' message itself. Unlike a political movement or a transient world order, his teachings embodied universal truth, truth which transcends time, culture, and geography. For instance, in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus didn't simply provide guidance for first-century Jews. He provided a paradigm for human living applicable to all time periods. These potential lessons on humility, mercy, forgiveness, and righteousness remain even salient today. His message of loving one's enemies was revolutionary for his time, and it is no easier to follow in ours. His parables of faith, wisdom, and the nature of God still challenge and transform lives. One of the major themes in Matthew's Gospel is the kingdom of heaven. Whereas worldly kingships thrive on power and armies and luxuries, Jesus described a kingship based on love and righteousness and spiritual renewal. It was not a particular physical place, but a reality that could manifest wherever the people chose to walk in God's ways. But does this idea belong in the modern world? Can a materialistic, technological, self-interest-driven world ever open up to such a concept? The short answer is yes and no. The kingdom of heaven cannot exist in a world where the greed are chosen by the generous to inherit the earth, the selfish inherit the earth, the hate are chosen by the loving to inherit the earth. But as Jesus himself declared, the kingdom of heaven is within you. Luke 17:21. This means that every time someone acts with compassion instead of cruelty, honesty instead of deceit, faith instead of fear, they are in that moment manifesting reality as the model of the kingdom. It is not about replacing one government with another one or a theocracy. It is about changing hearts. Whenever people decide to act on Jesus' teachings, even in small ways, the kingdom of heaven is formed in their parks, their own homes, and their own lives. The gospel, according to Matthew, challenges us. Are we building our own kingdoms, or are we building the kingdom of heaven? Jesus spoke in parables, and Matthew made note of it meticulously. But why didn't Jesus say it more plainly? Why did he always say, "He who has ears, let him hear"? His message is not meant for everyone, the truth is. Listening to him, some rejected his message. Others listened, but heard something different. But for those who were really searching, there was a deeper meaning buried beneath his words. To illustrate, consider the parable of the sower, Matthew 13. At a surface level, it's a straightforward farming story. Some seeds fall on rocky ground, some among thorns, and some on fertile soil. But Jesus was not speaking of agriculture. He was explaining how people receive the truth. Some hearts are calloused, some distracted, and some responsive and eager to grow. It was the same over and over in Matthew's Gospel. The spiritually blind missed the truth, but the humble and seeking found it. None of the wisest so-called religious leaders, the Pharisees, were able to comprehend. But ordinary fishermen, tax collectors, and even sinners discovered the truth. And the same principle applies to today. Some read the Gospel of Matthew and see only stories and ancient history. Others come to those same words and find life-changing wisdom. It's all in the listener's heart. If Matthew's Gospel still has meaning for us, what is that meaning? There are a few key takeaways that emerge. Faith over fear. Time and again, Jesus instructed his disciples not be afraid. Whether it was walking on water, healing sickness, prophesying his resurrection, he was sending the one message: have faith in God, not in your circumstances. Love over law. The religious leaders of Jesus' time focused on rules and regulations, but Jesus focused on love and mercy. Indeed, when asked what the greatest commandment of all was, he responded, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and love your neighbor as yourself." Service over status. In a world conquered by power and dominance, Jesus offered a radical idea. The greatest among you will be your servant. Matthew teaches us again and again that greatness is not measured in money or status, but in humility and service to others. Eternal perspective. Jesus cautioned against laying up treasures on earth and urged his disciples to seek first the kingdom of heaven. Matthew 6:19-33 KJV. Matthew's gospel begs the question, are we living for temporary success, or are we investing in something eternal? Tradition versus transformation. Jesus didn't come to uphold the religious traditions. He came to transform lives. He urged people not just to perform mindless rituals, but to something higher, deeper, and more meaningful. His words confront us still. Are ye so foolish? Having begun in the Spirit, are ye now made perfect by the flesh? Matthew's gospel is more than a book to be read. It's a message that requires a response. Do you listen merely because you've been told to, or do you listen well to understand? Building your own kingdom, or helping build the kingdom of heaven? Do you live in fear, or do you walk in faith? The buried treasure contained in Matthew's gospel is freely given to the truly searching heart. If you've been moved by this message, please let us know in the comments. What are your thoughts, your reflections, and your questions? If you enjoyed this discussion, think about giving us a thumbs up, subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into biblical wisdom, and if you're able for you to support us, then maybe consider sending us a super thanks. It really supports us with posting content like this. Matthew did not write his gospel for generations past, but for every generation. But the real question is, are we actually listening